You're such a genuine gem. Thank you for clicking on my video. I'm Brooke McKenna, but today's case is a solved one about the most normal serial killer. We always hear that serial killers looked so normal, that no one expected it, but this one really reminds you that it could be anyone. The person next to you, the loving family member, the stranger who showed you kindness, anyone at all. But there is only one small theory as to what caused him to do this, and yet the killer himself claimed that what happened didn't affect him at all. If you don't know, it's my absolute passion to tell these stories, and I mean no harm or disrespect when I do so, and I'm actually posting a ton this month for Foul Play February, so come back on Thursdays and Sundays for uploads, and I will be so excited to see you. Now let's get back to this story. So it was 1996 in Washington, and Shannon Renee Zielinski was a 38-year-old woman living in Spokane. She had a daughter named Heather, and she was known to be a free spirit and a pure soul. Shannon was working really hard to support her daughter, and she did end up making her money as a sex worker, which can be quite the dangerous life. In fact, she had an upcoming trial that she was going to have to testify at due to a double murder that she had witnessed. Now, a man named Joseph Andrews was actually being charged with the murder of a couple who were shot to death in their car. Now, more than 50 witnesses were set to testify, and this included Shannon, but unfortunately, she would never be able to because she would go missing. Now, she was found later on June 14th, and she was already deceased. She had a gunshot wound to the head, and investigators really did wonder if this was something that was a tactic to silence her. Joseph was also heard to say that he was going to get rid of a primary witness, and little did investigators know it would actually be much more sinister than that. And even though that didn't seem possible, there was going to be lots more victims to come. You see, sex workers would be disappearing in this area, and they were victims who had nothing to do with this trial, and so it really did make it seem like Shannon's death had nothing to do with her testimony. But since it was marked off as a targeted murder because of this trial, she wasn't easily connected to the rest of these women, and especially because sex workers are often targeted for multiple different reasons, and investigators don't always look into their cases, it took them a while to figure out something was happening. A year later, on August 26, 1997, a woman named Heather Marie Hernandez was found with just her bra and her shirt on, and she was partially nude. She was 20 years old, she had just moved to this area, and she had been shot to death as well. Only the next day, another woman was found. This was Jennifer Ann Joseph, who was only 16 years old. She was known to be a kind-hearted lady who treated everyone as if there was no stranger, and she was always one to lend a helping hand. She was known to be smart, and even so smart that she got bored of school around 14 and switched to alternative school. She was said to be happy, and she loved music. She was independent, and that is what often got her in trouble because she didn't want to follow the rules that her father had set for her. And so shortly after this, she ended up moving out with her friends. But now she was found shot to death as well. And witnesses had seen her getting into a white Corvette. The next month, on November 5th, Darla Sue Scott was found by a man who was walking his dog, and she was found in basically a shallow grave, and this man came upon her and found that she had been shot. She was 29 years old, and 2 plastic bags were covering her head. 4 women had all been shot and sexually assaulted, and the public were becoming more aware that this was happening. There were even billboards posted in the area asking if anybody had seen their killer, with all of their pictures up, and that's because the victim count didn't stop at 4. there were many more. The next month, on December 7th, Melinda Lee Mercer was found nearby in Tacoma. Now, she was a 24-year-old who had actually been suffering from a heroin addiction. She had called her mom a few weeks prior to this, asking for help, and her mother had even set her up with a treatment program. She never got to go, though. Her father said that he had a feeling she was dead. 11 days later, Shawn Johnson's body was found. She had a son who had just gotten married. She attended the wedding, and unfortunately, this is all I could find out about her, but she was killed as well. And only 8 days after this, it was another woman. This time it was Shawn Ann McLennan, and she was 39 years old. She had graduated college with a phlebotomist degree, and she had worked in multiple medical centers before this, before going on to be a sex worker. Now, she also had a son that she would take care of, and now he did not have a mother. That same day, 31-year-old Lori Page Wasson was found in the same exact location. She was actually a wife and a mother of a 13-year-old son. She loved Rottweilers, and all of these bodies had been found on the side of the road, but it's not like they were buried and hard to find. It just appeared as though they had been dropped in the easiest location possible. And investigators began to believe this was because the killer didn't fear being caught. He didn't think that anybody would be able to trace him back to the murders, and this made them believe he wasn't someone who would normally be around sex workers. They would make people point the finger at him. For the next month, no more bodies were found, but unfortunately this didn't mean the killer was done, because on February 8th of the next year, a little more than a month later, Sunny Gale Oyster was found, and she was 41 years old, and this woman never had it easy. You see, at 17 years old, she got pregnant for the first time, and she had a little boy, and it was so much for her that she turned to drugs, and she became addicted, and eventually she went on to sex work, and she even began trying to turn her life around, and that's what she was doing in Spokane, because she was entering a drug rehab program. She was going to church, she was seeing family, she was so excited to turn her life around and to have a better life, and then that life was brutally taken from her. This was a woman who was said to dive into the water without thinking about it as a child and to help her stepmother when she had cancer. She was selfless. She was a broken soul who was lost, but she deserved to live. Nearly a month after this, on April 1st, Linda Marie Mabin was a 34-year-old who was found by her leg being exposed under a pile of leaves. Now, her cause of death was the same, but investigators did wonder if it was a copycat doing this, and I couldn't find exactly why, but this is something that they wondered when they found her body. The other sex workers in the area said that Linda feared she was going to be killed by this killer and just had this gut instinct. But at this point, investigators had zero suspects, nobody to even question. However, they did have 2 different t-shirts they found at this crime scene where 3 of the bodies had been found. One was a pocket t-shirt that was light purple with a dirt stain on the front. The other was a light blue shirt that said Sun Valley in red print and had a yellow sun, and it was also size extra large. It also had a brown spot on it that looked like it could be blood. A task force was of course put together to find this killer, and nearly 920 tips were being called in. Investigators said it was going to take time to solve this case, but they felt good and comfortable with the information coming in. But they also began looking at their own records, believing that this killer would have a record of some sort that would have led him to this, and so they scoured all of their files and weren't finding anything either. But meanwhile, more bodies were being found, and sex workers were told of this. They were aware that this was happening. They were told to be more cautious, to really follow their gut. If they felt like someone was strange, to not go with them. And that was the thing. This was their job. They couldn't just stop doing this out of fear, even though many of them wanted to. They had to make their living. And so they continued doing it, continued to be super, super cautious, and they were super afraid at the same time, because these women that were going missing and being found deceased, They were their friends. Officers were stationed out on the streets with them to make sure they felt safe and in case they needed any help. But the fact that these women were still being targeted and going missing, even though investigators were right there, even though these women were cautious, told investigators that this killer appeared extremely normal. These women who were already on guard did not feel anything from him. And so nobody was suspecting him, and that made it even scarier. They also said he was local, he knew exactly where he was and what he was doing. Now, it was a month later on May 12th, and Melody Ann Murfin disappeared. She was 43 years old, and she had 2 daughters, and she never made it home, and her body was also never found. Then 2 months later, on July 7th, a 47-year-old named Michelin Joan Durning was discovered in a vacant lot, nude. Investigators talked to everyone in the area to see if they had seen anything, and they were also pleading with the public for more information, but nothing was coming in. Then there was a survivor. You see, it was August 1st, and 32-year-old Christine Smith was working, and she was picked up by a man who offered her $40. Now, Christine Smith, she got in the car, and she went with this man, and he was actually unable to perform, and that is when he got really angry. He took her money back, and then he pulled out a gun, and he shot her. Thankfully, in some kind of miracle, it ended up grazing her head, and she ran for her life. She was able to get to a police station where she gave them the story and a description, and then she was taken to the hospital where she was treated for an abrasion. But she was lucky to have survived. She didn't realize how close she was to being killed by a serial killer. At least not yet. Before investigators could find anything substantial about any of these cases or the killer, it was already October, 3 months later, and 35-year-old Connie LaFontaine Ellis was found in Tacoma. Now, she had 3 bags, plastic bags, placed over her head, and Connie was actually said to be the oldest of 5 children. She was extremely independent, incredibly strong, and she always tried to do her best in life and to make it. And she had dealt with losing 2 of her sons, and this caused her an incredible amount of grief. She lost one as a baby and one who was 11 years old and had a heart condition. All 13 sex workers who had gone missing and the 12 bodies of those who had been found were all believed to be linked. However, evidence could not prove that just yet, but they all occurred within a 2-year time period as well. All of the autopsies showed that these women were shot with a Raven .25 caliber handgun, and 2 of the autopsies showed that this killer was aiming for their heart. But they didn't know yet that there were more victims prior to this. But to get to that, I need to give you a killer. And for 2 years, no more bodies were found. And neither was this monster. However, little did the public know that investigators were finding a lot more information, and they were getting even closer to arresting a killer. Now, do you remember that white Corvette that Jennifer Joseph, who was the 16-year-old victim, got into that night? Well, since this was their only lead, investigators really honed in on this, and they decided to pull records of every person who owned a white Corvette nearby. They began stopping everybody they saw driving, and they found hundreds in the area. Some were brought in to be questioned, others were stopped on the side of the road. Many were asked for DNA tests, and they were getting multiple samples without any problem. Most people just, did what they were told. But then they stopped one man, and this man said he wanted to think about it, that this was too extreme of a request for a family man. And then he told them no. And investigators found that shortly after this man had sold his white Corvette. They decided to use this to their advantage. They tracked down the new owner of the car, and they asked him if they could look at his car. And of course, because he had no idea what was going on, he said yes. And so they quickly realized that they had seen the color of the car interior before. It was a very vibrant, strange color. It was not normal. And this was because at the crime scene of Jennifer Joseph, fibers matching that color were found on a towel nearby, and on her shoes. These fibers were taken from the crime scene and the car, and they came back as a match. They now had a warrant 5 days later to give to the car owner to officially search his car, and they would find a button under the floorboard in the back that matched one on Jennifer's shirt. They also found blood. The blood matched none other than Jennifer Joseph. This was enough to get a warrant to search the previous owner's home, the man that they originally wanted a DNA test from. And they searched his house and his vehicles and seized multiple different items, including firearms. And the investigators told the public that they had a person of interest. But this house didn't look like the house of a serial killer or an unstable man at all. This house belonged to a beloved father and husband. This man had 5 children and a wife who loved him. You see, 48-year-old Robert Lee Yates was the man that they were looking for, and nobody ever would have suspected him. Now, on April 18th of 2000, he was arrested for Jennifer Joseph's murder, but they believed that they could get him on many more. His wife and children were also taken away from the home so that they could preserve his home as a crime scene. Now, as investigators brought him down to the police station and they were working on getting a confession out of him, a woman called the police department, and this was Christine Smith, the survivor. She told them that they had the right guy. This was the guy who attacked her, and investigators were shocked that she was calling in, but this just gave them even more proof that this was the right guy. But at the same time, absolutely everybody who knew him did not believe it at all. He was also refusing to talk. So I guess now would be a good time to tell you a little bit about Robert Lee Yates. He was born on May 27th, 1952 to a middle-class family. They went to church, never cussed, and he had a lot of friends who said he had a wonderful family, one of them who even stayed with his family after his own mother passed. He graduated from high school as a baseball star and went on to work as an officer at a prison. Soon after, he enlisted in the Army and became a pilot. Those who served with him said that he was an incredible man, and when he served in Germany, his whole family actually moved there with him to be with him. He became an instructor, a pilot instructor for the Army, and he was also being stationed in Fort Lewis or the Tacoma area. The same year the murders began, he left active duty and moved with his family to Spokane. During this time, he was also pulled over with a sex worker in his car, and he told the officer that she was just one of his daughter's friends who he was driving home. 2 days after this incident with the police officer, this was the first time that investigators had any glimpse that he was not who he appeared to be. And this was because his 19-year-old daughter had gone into the police station and made a report saying that her father had hit her. He was charged with a misdemeanor assault, and a year later, which was during his murder spree, he enlisted in the Army National Guard. But during all of this, he had his wife Linda, who he had met while working as this prison guard. They had been together for 26 years. They had 4 daughters and 1 son from ages 10 to 25 at this time. The neighbors said they loved him. They always saw him outside playing with his kids. He always took them camping and to ball games, and he was so normal. Robert worked at Kaiser Aluminum and was known to be a hard worker. Robert's own father said that he was a completely normal child as well. He had grown up a better than average student. He was obedient and responsible and had normal young boy interests like sports. He had a lot of friends, and sex workers who he had been with and he didn't kill said he was quite the gentleman, and they loved going out with him. And he was attractive, nice to talk to, and he paid well. One of which even got even deeper into a relationship and was calling him at work, and they were, talking all the time. And this woman said that she now can't even trust her own gut instinct because she didn't see any sign of a monster. She said now she can't even trust her own judgment. She also said one time when they were together, they were talking about the murders, and she was talking about that, maybe it's a cab driver, and he said, well, maybe it's a police officer. But at the same time, Robert's family had a feeling in the back of their head that they didn't want to admit to. They just didn't expect the truth to be so horrific. They didn't necessarily say that he was abusive towards his wife, but he could be abusive towards his children, is what they said. And when all of this happened, his wife was in complete shock, and they were crying all the time. And she said that, looking back on it now, Robert did like to go out hunting all the time alone. He often took trips, and he would put cologne on beforehand, but she didn't think anything of it. And she said when you're so close to somebody, you don't see it. She also said he was a very moody person. One minute he could be real easygoing, and he'd go into a room and come out and be a totally different person. The children then came forward saying that they had seen something horrific when they were younger that they didn't even want to remember until this point. One day their dad came home and there was blood all over the back of the car. The children then asked him what this was from, and here's the footage of them talking about their experience.
Remember when he came home that night and he said he hit a dog and there was blood all over the back of the van?
Yeah, I remember asking him about it. I was like, what happened there? Oh, I accidentally ran into a dog, and I had to set it on the back of, there was a fold-out bed, and I had to set it there and take it to the vet.
These children felt horrible about what their father had done and actually would go on to speak at his trial for the victims. But like I said, the 13 victims we have talked about weren't said to be the only ones. In fact, there was Stacy Elizabeth Hahn, who was a 23-year-old living in Seattle, and she was a sex worker who disappeared in July of 1988. This is where Robert was on military leave at the time. It was also 8 years prior to when he was believed to start killing. And then it was found that a case even earlier to this could be connected to Robert as well. It was a year before this, and 18-year-old Tanya Van Kulenborg was found shot to death in a wooded area in Seattle. She was sexually assaulted, partially clothed, and shot. And her boyfriend was found 2 days later, and he was strangled. However, then they found a case that was 12 years prior to that, and this was on July 3rd of 1975. A couple were having a picnic in the park, and this was Patrick Allen Oliver, who was 21 years old, and Suzanne Patricia Savage, who was 22. They were both shot. Investigators believed he could be linked to all of these, as well as many more they didn't know about, since he had been killing or had thought to have killed long before they believed he did. But Robert pled not guilty. The prosecution wanted the death penalty, but the defense had another idea. They offered a plea deal. They said that Robert would take a polygraph test admitting to these 13 murders and tell them where the one victim they could not find would be found. This would get him life instead of death. Now, some family members of the victims were on board with this. Others were very angry about it. But the information Robert would give would be the most disturbing information thus far, because do you remember the 43-year-old we talked about, Melody Ann Murfin, who had disappeared and never been found? Well, Robert drew a map of where her body was buried, and investigators headed to the scene to where her body was, and they ended up at Robert's family home. She was buried in the front yard under plants around 6 inches beneath the ground, just outside of Robert and Linda's bedroom window. His lawyers said that Robert was remorseful and wanted to put this matter to rest. So he ended up pleading guilty to the 13 murders and the one attempted, and apologized to the victim's family in the courtroom. He was crying, he told everyone he turned to God, and he then received 408 years in prison. But the next year, Robert would go on trial for the murders of the women who he murdered in Tacoma. This time, they wanted to get him for the death penalty. The prosecution said that he was a man with a mask of normalcy, but one with a one-of-a-kind hobby. That he found vulnerable women and he killed them. Again, he pled not guilty, but he was sentenced to death. However, in 2013, his attorneys filed a habeas corpus saying that he was mentally ill due to his paraphilic disorder that caused him to commit murder. However, his sentence was pushed back when Washington Governor Jay Inslee declared he would not sign any death warrants while he was in office. So 2 years later, he appealed.
Tomorrow, serial killer Robert Yates will learn if he can get his death penalty conviction overturned and avoid execution. The Spokane man was convicted of murdering 11 women in Spokane, but sent to death row after he was prosecuted for killing 2 other victims in Pierce County. KXLY4's Jeff Humphreys live in our newsroom tonight. Jeff, the state Supreme Court is reviewing the convictions from the west side of the state.
Yeah, Dave, that's where Yates feels the court made 21 different mistakes during his double murder trial in Tacoma. In his 270-page appeal, Yates is using the shotgun approach, hoping to give the Supreme Court at least one reason to overturn his death sentence. Specifically, that Yates had agreed to plead guilty to murders in both Spokane and Tacoma, but having made those confessions, Pierce County prosecutors pulled out of the deal and then double-crossed the killer. Yates then stood trial in Tacoma for the murders of 2 women there, but his jury was allowed to hear testimony about Yates's role in the deaths of more than a dozen Spokane victims, and typically those prior bad acts are not admissible. The appeal also challenges the use of an FBI profiler, the qualifications of the jury, and whether the murderers were part of a common scheme or plan. All issues that Yates is carefully following from his cell on death row.
This was rejected. Then in 2018, the Washington Supreme Court ruled that the death penalty violated the Constitution, and Robert Yates was then sentenced to life instead of death. Now, the only theory anyone had as to why Robert would do this, what led him to this, was what his father said happened to him when he was 6 years old. You see, Robert apparently eventually told his mother that he had been sexually assaulted by a 12-year-old when he was 6 years old, and his family and some others believed that this could be why he turned to sexually assaulting others and killing them. However, to Robert, he doesn't think so. He says that he doesn't know why that would make a difference in his life. However, psychologically, this could have made a huge difference even if he didn't realize it. But there was also the fact that murder ran in his family. That's right. You see, his father's parents, so his grandparents, had a fight that resulted in his grandpa's death. She was arrested, put in a mental hospital for 7 years for his murder. Did murder run in the family? Was this something that Robert was just going to do? Or was there another reason this was how he ended up? That's why this one is so disturbing to me over others who appear normal, because there's not even a motive here. It just appears he was this normal guy who on the side was killing because he wanted to, because he did. It doesn't even seem like, I don't know, I can't explain it. I feel like he killed simply because that's what he did, you know? It was just like an action he just kept doing. I can't even describe how creepy he feels to me, and I'd love to know if he creeps you out as much as he creeps me out. But killers who can have a family and who can appear like a loving person to everybody else scares me, because his family and what they went through, the abuse they went through, the psychological abuse they had to have gone through, is a lot. And we often don't think about them as victims, but they are. That's what they are. They were living with a serial killer who every day was probably fighting his urge to kill them. And as disturbing as that is, it could be the truth. That's the kind of person that you can't expect, that you can't prepare for, that you can't make sure you stay away from. And that's the scariest part of all. So please stay safe. Please keep on guard. And if you ever see anything strange, don't just believe the first thing someone tells you. Okay? Okay. Don't ever forget to speak up. Your voice is powerful enough, and I love you to absolute pieces. Okay? Bye.